Hi Year 10, that's Mr. Azzopardi with another video for GCSE RE. This is the first lesson in a new topic. So we've done 3 topics on the philosophy and ethics exam. Obviously we've started a bit of Buddhism, which we're going to pick up again next year. But this is going to be the last unit, so there are 4 units altogether in the philosophy and ethics exam. This is the last unit. So that will mean usually, if we didn't have this strange circumstances, we would do 2 units of philosophy and ethics in year 10 and 2 in year 11, and then we'd do the religious focus, Buddhism focus in year 10, Christianity focus in year 11. As it is, we're going to have covered by the end of this year all of the philosophy and ethics, and then we will be doing the Buddhism, picking up with the Buddhism next year, and then doing the Christianity focus next year. If you've got any questions about how we're structuring the course, do let me know. Just send me an email. Okay, so this unit has got a long name, so I'm just going to do a little bit before we do the first lesson on what the unit is. So the unit is called Dialogue Within and Between Religious and Non-Religious Beliefs and Attitudes. So quite a long and confusing name, but that doesn't mean that the stuff in the unit is confusing. So I'm just going to do a little bit to get your head around what this unit's about. So what this unit is really about is about the way in which people who have religious beliefs, for us it's Christian beliefs, because we're looking at the when we do philosophy and ethics, we look at all those units from a Christian perspective mainly. How people who have Christian beliefs interact with non-religious beliefs and with other religions in society. And I think it's actually quite a relevant topic because, you know, if you went back 100 years, 200 years in this country, it would be a very different kind of country. And one of the big differences would be that people would be much more religious. Religion would be kind of taken for granted, that most people were Christian and most people shared Christian worldviews. And today that's certainly not true, even though, as we'll see, quite a lot of people still identify in some way as Christian. There are a lot more non-religious people, and there are lots more people who have different religions in the country, and that makes things complicated. So that the unit is really about what we do in a society where there's lots of different kinds of worldviews. How do those worldviews get on? Do they conflict? Do they agree? What do we do when they conflict and they agree? How do we make it so there's less conflict between religious and non-religious people, or between different peoples of different religions? That kind of stuff. It's also about the whole question of whether it's right to call Britain a religious country or not, and that's going to be the topic of this lesson today. So let's have a look at some of the topics that are covered in this unit. So again, this is not the lesson really on the lesson for today. This is just some general information about this unit to get your head around it. So today we're going to look at this question: is Britain a Christian country? And actually, that will be the kind of another way of looking at that question will be the subject of lesson number 2. That's the second question is going to be this one. What is secularization? That's to do with that first question. Are we a Christian country or have we become less Christian? If you don't know what that word is, secularization, don't worry. I'm not expected to know it right now, but we'll cover it in the lesson. What roles does religion play in education? So this is about RE in schools, and also about faith schools. The idea that there are some schools that are actually Christian or Muslim or Hindu schools. So it's about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose. Should religion play a role in deciding laws about medical ethics? Now, this is about stuff that we actually looked at a bit in year 9. So we're talking about abortion, euthanasia, IVF, those kind of issues in medical ethics. Now, it's interesting here because those were always, you know, obviously some of the topics people found most interesting in GCSE RE, and you know, you might think, well, when you do those lessons, you might think, do these really fit in this unit? Or maybe some people have suggested the exam board just felt like we've got to keep these units in the GCSE somewhere, so they just shoved them in this unit to make sure they're in the GCSE because people enjoy studying them so much. But the way in which, the reason they put them in this unit, the way they think about it is that most of the debates about abortion, about euthanasia, involve a conflict between religious and non-religious views. So it's kind of like a lot of Christians are against abortion, and most non-Christians tend to have a more positive view of abortion or accepting view of abortion. Same with euthanasia. So it's kind of like looking at the question of, well, should Christianity influence the laws we have in the country about medical ethics? Next one, what are the main areas of conflict between religious and non-religious worldviews? So in other words, what other areas apart from medical ethics do religious and non-religious people disagree about? There's some link here to stuff we did in families and relationships, things like divorce, those kind of things. Yes, we'll look at some of the other areas of conflict between religious and non-religious people. We'll look at this thing called interfaith dialogue. So interfaith dialogue is when different religions kind of speak to each other. The idea, I suppose, being that in the past, when you had like most people in one country were one religion, most people in another country were another religion, it didn't really matter that the religions disagreed, because people weren't coming up against people of different religions in their everyday life very much. But today, when we got a globalized society and there's lots of people of different religions in each country, then that means that the differences between religions can cause more conflict. So we look at how do religions, particularly Christians from the perspective of our study, how do they try to reduce conflict between religions by talking more to other people of other religions. Last one, what do Christians believe about non-Christian worldviews? So that's kind of linked to interfaith dialogue. So this is like things like this. Do Christians believe that it's okay to be a non-Christian? Or do Christians think that, you have to be a Christian because you're going to go to hell if you're not a Christian? Do Christians think it's better to be religious even if you're not Christian? Or do Christians accept people with completely non-religious worldviews? So we've already done some stuff about that. We looked at exclusivists and pluralist Christians in the Families and Relationships unit when we talked about raising children religiously, but we'll look some more about that and look at, it'll end up with us getting a more complicated view, I suppose, than just exclusivist and pluralist. Okay, those are the main topics. It's quite a short unit, actually. When I teach in class, I usually take 9 lessons to do. I don't know if we'll take more or less on the video, but yeah, we should be done with lessons, well before the end of the year, which is great because that means we can do a little bit of consolidation, revision. I'm still hoping to do a lesson where I look at some of the more tricky exam questions for the previous unit. So that should be coming up at some point after half term. Okay, so let's have a look at this particular topic. So this is the first question within the unit, the first lesson within the unit, and this is the question. The title is, how can I use evidence to support the claim that Britain is a Christian country? Now, the way the lesson's going to work is there's no resources for this. It's all going to be straight off the video. So I want you to write that in as a title. We're then going to make a few notes under that title, and then we're going to do the main note-taking part, which is, I usually do as a spider diagram, like a mind map spider diagram kind of thing, but you can do it as you want. If you want to just do it on A4 paper, however you find it's easiest to lay it out, you do that. So for the time being, if you put that title, how can I use evidence to support the claim that Britain is a Christian country? Now, the first thing I would do in a lesson is would have some discussion about, well, what kind of evidence would help us to decide whether Britain is a Christian country? In other words, if we were going to make this decision, is Britain a Christian country or is it no longer a Christian country? What kind of evidence could we use? And the things that people often come up with are, well, firstly, we could look at how many people in the country say that they're Christians. If 100% of people in Britain say they're Christians, then it sounds like we're a pretty Christian country. If 0% said they're Christians, then it sounds like we're not a very Christian country. So obviously those kind of statistics are important. What else could you look at? Well, you could look at number of people who go to church, because maybe a lot of people claim they're Christian, but they don't go to church very often. This is the kind of thing that was kind of common in my generation, maybe less in my generation, more in my parents' generation, I suppose, is that it seemed like for many years people still claimed that they were Christian if you asked them in like a survey, but people just stopped going to church. So that's one thing that happened in this country. So church attendances went down and down and down, but people still tended to identify themselves as Christian. Interestingly, even if they didn't really believe in it, they just kind of saw it as that was their background or their culture or something. I think for many years my family's Catholic, and my parents are lapsed Catholics. That means they don't really believe it anymore. So I think for many years, though, even after they didn't go to church and they didn't really believe in it, my parents would have put their religion, if someone had asked them, would have said they were Catholic. So that's how it used to happen. I think in future generations, that's becoming less common. It's less common for people to just say, oh, I'm Christian, just because their parents were. People tend to identify with what they really believe now. But see, that's another way you could measure it. So you could measure it on people who say they're Christians. You could measure it on number of people who go to church. However, those aren't the only two ways of measuring it. I'm going to put a slide up what I want you to take some notes on next, which shows that deciding whether we're a Christian country is a bit more complicated. So so for this slide, just make notes on it. You can write the whole thing down, or you can pick out the key points. It's up to you. So when people say that Britain is a Christian country, they are not just thinking about how many people in Britain are practicing Christians. So, that could be definitely one measure, how many people are Christians. But there are other things to think about too. They are also thinking about the role that Christianity plays in British public life. And you need to have that phrase written down, the role that Christianity plays in British public life. What do I mean by that? Well, here are some of the things. Firstly, the Church of England is what's called the established religion in Britain. This means it has official connections with the government. We're going to look at those in a bit. But we are officially a Christian country because the Church of England is the established religion, the established church. One of those things is that the Queen is the head of the country, but also the head of the Church of England. But there are other things too. So we are officially, for official purposes, even if no one went to church, we'd officially be a Christian country because the Church of England is the established religion. That's one way in which Christianity plays a role in British public life. I've just said this one, the Queen is the head of the Church of England. That's really significant. We'll look at it again, but it's significant because Queen is supposed to be the head of the country and she's the head of the church. So it means that there's a kind of link between the British identity and Christian identity. We have many religious schools. Again, you may know people who go to St. Benedict's. I doubt that everybody who goes there is super religious. But it's still significant that we have schools that are run by religious organisations. It means that religion has a role in our country in the education system, even if lots of people who go to those schools aren't actually religious themselves. Bishops sit in the House of Lords, so we're going to talk about that in a bit, but the House of Lords is part of the British Parliament, the groups that run the country, and bishops, who are people who are in high up position in the Church of England, sit in the House of Lords. They are part of the organisation that makes decisions about laws and about how the country is run. So that means Church of England has an influence over our laws. Again, whether or not people in the country are actually religious. Lastly, I don't know how significant this is, but we'll look at it again as the units go through, as the topics go through. Our major holidays are linked to religion. Think about it. Christmas, Easter, they are the two major holidays in this, two major celebrations in this country. They are both Christian holidays. One explains the, one is linked to the incarnation of Jesus. That's when Jesus was born, when God became a human being, according to Christians, and one is linked to the resurrection of Jesus. So, our holidays and the holidays that most people celebrate are Christian holidays. Now, you might have a question about that, but let's come back to that later because we're going to look at that later. Okay, so this is the bit I was going to do as a mind map. So either, and this would be for me on an A3 piece of paper, but if you haven't got that, do it as you think you can do it. So you might just, if you're just working on A4, you might just want to put this title. What evidence is there that Britain is a Christian country at the top? Then I want you to use two colours if you can. And what I want you to do for every slide I go through, I want you to put in one colour the information. So just explain why people might think that Britain is a Christian country in one colour, And then in another colour, I want you to say the kind of criticism. This is your evaluation. Reasons to think this doesn't make Britain a Christian country in a different colour. So for each one, we're going to give you a reason why someone might say Britain is a Christian country. But then I also want you to make the argument against and say, well, why might someone question this? Why might someone say, hold on, that doesn't make Britain a Christian country? So that's your title. What evidence is there that Britain is a Christian country? Either at the top of your A4 page or in the middle of your mind map. So let's go on to the first one and you'll see how it goes. There's quite a few of these. It might be quite a long video. Okay, let's go for the first one. Okay, you can see there's quite a lot of writing here, and in some there is quite a bit of writing, so you need to condense it. You can't write down everything. So I'm going to talk through it. I'm going to talk through what the information is, and then I'm going to talk through how you might criticize it. So the first one is history. The history of Christianity in Britain goes back almost 2,000 years when it was introduced by the Romans. From about the 7th century, British Christianity was part of the Catholic Church, so this used to be a Catholic country, the Roman Catholic Church. However, in the 16th century, King Henry VIII left the Catholic Church and made the Church of England an independent church. That meant the Church of England was separate from the Catholic Church. It was just its own organisation. For a long time, members of religions other than the Church of England had less rights. For example, Catholics weren't allowed to have seats in Parliament until 1829. So once Britain left the Catholic Church, people who decided to stay Catholic had less rights than people who were who became members of this new church, the Church of England. This has changed today. Obviously, Catholics can be in Parliament, but it is still the case that the monarch, that's the king or queen, must be a member of the Church of England. Now, why are all these things significant? Well, it shows that historically Christianity has had a massive role. You know, it's not just that lots of people in Britain were Christian, it's that it was the official religion of the country. At first, yes, Catholic Christianity, and then the change was made, it was the Church of England. But also that, you know, if you weren't, religion was so important that if you weren't a member of the Christian church, the right Christian church, as the way the king saw it, then you had less rights. You didn't have full rights as a person in this country. So yeah, historically, we've definitely been a Christian country, and Christianity has played a huge role in the history of the country. Now, the criticism will probably be that just because we used to be a Christian country, that doesn't mean we're a Christian country anymore. I don't think anyone would dispute that we at one time were a Christian country. The question is, are we still a Christian country? And some people might say, it doesn't matter what happened in the past, it's what happens now. Now, you could come back to that and say, well, hold on. There's still some things about that are on that history slide that are true today. For example, the king or queen has to be a member of the Church of England. But what you might say is, well, that's quite a small thing. Most of the thing, a lot of the history of our country, which was very religious, has gone now. So can we say just because of our history that we're really a Christian country? That would be my response. Okay, second one coming up. Okay, statistics. The chart on the right of this page shows that the typo there shows the percentage of people of different faiths recorded in the 2011 census. So every 10 years in this country there is a census. That is where every household is sent a form to fill in to give the government, not the country, the government information about statistics in the country. So they know about how many percentage of people do different jobs and all this other kind of thing. How many people are in the country? That's one of the main. That's where we get our knowledge about the population of the country. Now, as this shows in this chart, Christianity is still the largest religion in Britain, with over 31 million people calling themselves Christian, and only 25% saying no religion. However, one thing we know is the number of. So this is that would be my main point. The 2011 census suggested that more people call themselves Christian than any other religion, and even than people who say no religion. So still, the majority of people seem to identify as Christians. 31 million people is quite a lot. However, what's the response? Well, the response is on there. The number of Christians in Britain is definitely falling. We know this because the number of Christians in 2011 was down 12% when compared with the 2001 census. So it happens every year, every 10 years, the census. So in 2001, the figure was much higher, and it's fallen in 2011. And considering we're in 2020 now, it could be that the figure has fallen dramatically in that time. We'll have to see when the next census comes out what percentage of people call themselves Christian. Interesting statistically, I was kind of surprised by this when I looked this up, that still the majority in 2011 called themselves Christian, but it is falling. So on your notes, you just need to have the statistics. Look, most people in the country call themselves Christian, so that should be evidence that we are a Christian country. But then the fact that it's falling, and it might have fallen even more since 2011, would be your criticism, your evaluation. Okay, 3, the Queen as the head of the Church of England. So the ruling monarch of this country, the King or Queen in Britain, is both the head of the state, of the government, and the head of the Church of England. Just as one thing to say about that, often in the class people say, but sir, isn't the Prime Minister the head of the country? Well, yeah, in many ways the Prime Minister is the head of the country, or at least the person who makes most of the decisions in the country, but officially the head of the state, the head of the government is the Queen. So when a new Prime Minister is voted in after an election, what they do is they go to see the Queen and ask permission to form a parliament. So and the Queen gives them the permission. So officially, when there's an election and a Prime Minister is voted in, he then has to go and ask permission for the Queen to kind of take up his position as ruler of the country. So the Queen is the ruler of the country. Technically, she's at the top of the government, not the Prime Minister. But we'll come back to that when we look at criticisms. So the religious role. So the Queen, she's the head of the country, and she's the head of the Church of England. And here's a few things. The religious role of the Queen is shown in these ways. One of the titles of the Queen is Defender of the Faith, which means that, she's a protector of the Church of England. Secondly, when she's crowned, and when the next monarch is crowned, they have to make a vow, promise to maintain and preserve the teachings and practices of the Church of England. So they promise to not only to kind of rule over the country, but to make sure the Church of England is maintained and kept in the right way. When someone is appointed to a senior role in the Church of England, such as a bishop, it must be approved by the Queen. So, if they want to make a bishop, and the bishops are the people who run the Church of England. Archbishop of Canterbury is the top bishop, but then the rest, you have lots of different other bishops from different parts of the country. So when they appoint those bishops, it must be approved by the Queen. She's got to say yes to it. In practice, the actual decision is made by people in the church, but in theory, the Queen has the power to prevent a bishop from being appointed. So the Queen, in theory, she could say no, but in practice, that doesn't actually happen. In practice, it's just a ceremonial thing, really. They send it to her and she says yes. She must also approve any changes in the rules of the church. So if they want to make a change in the rules of the church, for example, when they bought, it used to be that there couldn't be women priests, but they changed that. I think 1992, I think they changed that. And then more recently, they allowed there to be women bishops. Well, the Queen has to approve those changes. She has to say it's okay. So in all of these ways, it feels like, why would that make us a Christian country? Well, it's like the person who rules the country is the person who rules the church. That shows that they're kind of there's a fundamental link between our country and the Church of England, because they're headed by the same person. Now, criticism, well, there's quite easy ways to criticise this. One way is to say, well, yeah, okay, in theory, the Queen is the head of the country and the head of the Church of England, but in practice, is she really the head of either? Because, yeah, in terms of political power, obviously the Prime Minister and the government have a lot more political power. The Queen is not allowed, if the Prime Minister goes to the Queen after an election and says, I want to form a parliament, a government, she's not allowed to say no. She has to say yes. So we might say that the Queen is only the ceremonial head of the of the country. In the same way, we might say she's only the ceremonial head of the Church of England. You know, as I've said there, the Queen is not allowed to say no when someone says we want to appoint this bishop. She's not really allowed to say no. If the Church of England says we want to have women priests, she can't say no, I don't want to have women priests. She has to approve it. So, yeah, you could say the criticism here would be that although the Queen is the head of both the Church of England and the country, she's actually not head of either, really. She's just the ceremonial head of the two. And there's an interesting question, because some people might say, yeah, but that still makes us a Christian country because we've got the same ceremonial head. You know, it shows that link. We've decided that the ceremonial head of our country is the ceremonial head of the Church of England. I should say, when I say ceremonial head, that what I mean by that is she's just the symbol at the top. She doesn't actually have any power. However, other people might say, but look, imagine if Boris Johnson was both Prime Minister who made the decisions over a country. I mean, there's a bit of a debate about whether he does make the decisions, but still, we'll put that to one side. Imagine if Boris Johnson, he's the head of the country, he makes all the decisions, really, and imagine he was the head of the church. Imagine Boris Johnson made all the decisions about who was bishops and whether we had women priests and all those kind of things. Some people might say, look, that would show we were a real religious country. If our Prime Minister was making real decisions about religion in the country, that would show that we had a fundamental link between government and Christianity. But we don't have that. The Queen is not the real head of either. So some people might say that doesn't make us properly a Christian country. I hope that made sense. Okay, bishops in the House of Lords. Now, there's loads on this slide, but that's because I just want to make it clear how these things work. You don't need to write all this down. You will not need to explain all this stuff in when you're writing paragraphs and stuff like that. So don't write everything down here. Just pick out the key parts. Most importantly, you don't really need to have an explanation in your notes of the difference between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. You just need to make sure that you understand it. If you want to write it down, I suppose you can. It's up to you. So bishops in the House of Lords. So the Houses of Parliament are where British laws are made, and it has two parts. So that the laws of the country are made in the Houses of Parliament. And there are two sections of the House of Parliament. The House of Commons is where the MPs, members of Parliament, sit and make decisions. So they are the people who are voted into power in elections. And in this house, they vote to decide on whether to make new laws. So if they want to change the law in any kind of way, they will vote about that in the House of Parliament. And, they vote. If the majority of MPs, members of Parliament, are in favour, then the law has passed through the House of Commons. And that is probably the most, that you'd have to say that is the most influential, powerful part of Parliament. However, there is also this thing called the House of Lords. The job of this house is to make sure that the House of Commons is doing its job properly and not passing laws which harm the country. New laws have to pass a vote in both houses. So you have to, in the House of Commons, the MPs have to pass it, have to vote for it, and then in the House of Lords, the Lords, that's what they call the people who sit in the House of Lords, they have to vote to pass the laws. Now, it should, the idea is not supposed to be that the House of Lords stop a lot of the things that the House of Commons want to do. The idea is they have to check them to make sure they're okay, to make sure the government's doing its job properly. It's supposed to be a kind of a group of people who make sure that the House of Commons isn't going wrong, isn't doing the wrong thing, isn't making any disastrous decisions. That's the idea. So in most cases, the House of Commons will vote for a law, and then the House of Lords will look at the law and say, is this okay? And they might look at the details. They might look at, well, okay, is every single aspect of it okay? Is there any things about the wording of this law? Because laws can be very complicated. Is there any things that are a problem? Do we need to change it? And so on and so on. So the whole thing is supposed to be to check that the House of Commons is doing its job okay, and that kind of thing. Why do they need something like that? Well, I mean, what often happens in Parliament is in the House of Commons is we have an election, and one side will win the election, they'll have the most MPs. So if you think about at the moment, they had an election and the Conservative Party won, and so they've got more MPs in the House of Commons. So what would often happen in that situation is that the Conservative Party would then want to bring in some laws. So they would, Boris Johnson or whoever would suggest a law they want to bring in. But because they have a majority in the House of Commons, because they've got more MPs, then they're almost guaranteed to vote in that law because, all the Conservative Party would want that law to take place. There aren't enough MPs on the other side to vote against it. And that's obviously a fine thing because people have voted for those MPs. So people have wanted people in the country have voted for those MPs, and so it's considered the right thing that those MPs, they're allowed to vote whatever law they want into the country. The problem that would be without the House of Lords, that there'd be nobody to check, but is this actually a good law? Are there any problems with this law? Are there things that we need to change about it? Because of the way Parliament works, the majority of the MPs vote for it. If there was no House of Commons, even if it was not a very good law, it would just go through. So the House of Lords is there to kind of check it's okay. Hope that makes sense. Now, unlike the MPs in the House of Commons, members of the House of Lords are not elected, so no one votes for them. And they're divided into two groups, the Lords Temporal and the Lords Spiritual. The Lords Temporal are either appointed by the government or receive their place in the House from their parents. So some people are hereditary lords. That means they're these kind of posh families who are lords of places, and this is the way it always used to be. When the father dies or the mother dies or whatever, then it's passed on to their children, or one of their children. So that's one way people get the House of Lords. Another one is, they're appointed by the government. So the government has a decision every year, or I don't know when it is, but every so often to appoint new people to the House of Lords. And they would generally appoint people, maybe retired politicians, people who've worked in a political world and know about politics, that kind of thing. However, the other, so you've got the people who are appointed by the government and the people who get it from their parents, and then you have the Lords Spiritual. Though the Lords Spiritual are 26 bishops of the Church of England, so 26 bishops in the Church of England have a place in the House of Lords. And they are given that place just because they're bishops. So as soon as they become a bishop, they get to go into the House of Lords and they get to vote on laws and see if laws should be passed. Now, all this is a very long explanation. All you really need to know is 26 bishops of the Church of England sit in the House of Lords, and as a result, those bishops have some power over some power over voting on laws in this country. They have they have some power over the laws of this country. So that seems significant, right? The fact that bishops in the Church of England sit in the House of Lords means that the Church has some power in deciding how the country should be run. So that's what you really need to know. In the House of Lords, there are 26 bishops, and that means that the Church of England as a group, this Christian organisation, has some power over how the country is run. And significantly, that's not because they're voted in. So it's not like lots of people thought, we really want these bishops to decide over the country. No, they just get that position in the House of Lords, whether people want them there or not, because there's no voting. Just because they're bishops, they get there. So this suggests in some ways that this country is a Christian country, because we automatically give some power to decide how the country is run to the leadership in the Church of England. So that's been a really long explanation. Now, why might we argue against this and say that this doesn't make Britain a Christian country? Well, one is that 26, I don't know how many lords there are overall, but there are lots. 26 is quite a small number, so they haven't got a lot of power. The House of Lords is less powerful than the House of Commons because the House of Lords doesn't make up its own laws, and in most cases it's supposed to approve the things that the government does. So it's not like the House of Lords is really the most powerful group in the government. It's not like the House of Lords can decide the way the country's run. It's just there to check things. So what you might say is, it's interesting that there are bishops in the House of Lords, But the real power in our country is in the House of Commons. MPs, the Prime Minister, those people are the people who make the laws, who vote on what's going to be the law in this country. The House of Lords there is just there to check things. It's not actually making the big decisions in the country. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if it's a bit rambling and confusing. Okay, so number 5, this is a bit more simple. Public holidays. Many public holidays, and those are days when most businesses in the country are closed, in Britain are linked to Christian days of worship. Now, some people say to me, sir, but the biggest holiday, the most important holidays we have are the summer holidays. But the summer holidays are only important, really, if you're a pupil at school or a teacher. Because we're like, oh yeah, in the summer you have 6 weeks off. But I hate to break it to you, if you don't become a teacher when you're older, then you don't get 6 weeks off. You have to decide when you take your holiday yourself, and very few jobs give you 6 weeks holiday. So yeah, become a teacher or don't. It's quite difficult to. So putting that to one side, you might think that summer holidays are most important, but they're not really a proper holiday that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about days when most businesses and places are closed. So the most important holidays in this country are linked to days of worship. Good Friday remembers the crucifixion of Jesus, so that's part of the Easter holidays. Easter Monday. This emphasises the importance of Easter Sunday, which celebrates the resurrection of Jesus, by giving people an extra day off at this weekend. So you get the Friday off before. The Monday is not a special day in the Christian calendar, but the reason you get that Monday off is because the Easter Sunday is really important, the Sunday of Easter. So Easter, you have Good Friday, you have Easter Saturday, then you have Easter Sunday, which celebrates Jesus coming back to life, the resurrection. Then you have the Monday as a holiday, but that Monday is only a holiday because of the Sunday that comes before. You've got Christmas Day, which is the day Jesus was born. It celebrates what Christians call the Incarnation, when God became a human being. And then Boxing Day, which celebrates the Feast of St. Stephen. That's the day after Christmas Day. Again, that was traditionally considered a Christmas, a religious celebration. You probably know that. Probably heard that song. Good King Wenceslas went out on the Feast of Stephen. That's Boxing Day. Until 1971, there was also a public holiday to mark Pentecost, the time when Jesus' followers were visited by the Holy Spirit. This was known as Whit Monday in this country. So Pentecost used to have a holiday associated with it too. So why does this make us a religious country? Well, if you think about it, if you would say if someone was to come to this country, didn't know anything about this country, didn't know anything about religion, and said, what's your main holidays? And we said, well, we have Christmas. And they were like, what's that about? And you say, well, that celebrates the Incarnation, which is when Jesus was born, and that means God became a human. Because in the Bible it says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And they said, okay, right, it's interesting. What's the next most important holiday? You say, oh, Easter. And they said, well, what's that? And they said, well, what happens at Easter is on the Good Friday, it celebrates when Jesus died. And in dying on the cross, he paid for our sins and meant that people who believed in him could go to heaven. And then on Sunday, on the Sunday of Easter, we celebrate the resurrection, which is when Jesus was raised from the dead. And Jesus being raised from the dead is important to Christians because it guarantees that he has power over life and death. And that means that people who believe in him can get to heaven when they die. Now, those people would think, wow, that is a pretty religious country. It sounds very religious. Their two major holidays are so deeply about religious things. They're about the most important things in Christianity. The Incarnation of Jesus, and then the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So it makes us sound very religious. So yeah, I think it's a really good point. That's a really good one to use in an exam thing, to say our holidays make us a religious country. However, what's the problem here? Well, the big problem is that in theory it makes us look like a religious country, but how religiously are these holidays celebrated? If you look at Christmas, people nowadays, many people in this country associate it with presents, Christmas trees, Santa, all those kind of things, spending time with family, and they don't think of it anything to do with Christianity at all. That you might get a little bit of kind of the nearest a lot of people come to Christianity is this idea that you could have goodwill towards others. It's kind of time to practice love your neighbour. You can be nice to people on Christmas. But generally, people don't celebrate Christmas as a Christian holiday. They just celebrate it as a nice time to have presents and get together with your family. What about Easter? Well, for most people today, Easter seems to be about chocolate eggs. And I hate to disappoint you, but there's no chocolate eggs in the Bible, not mentioned at all. So again, we've got this problem where on the first glance, this seems to be about Christianity, but it's not about Christianity today. So what I would say is those holidays have lost, to many people, they've lost their Christian meaning, and they're not considered Christian holidays anymore. I know lots of people who love Christmas, who eat chocolate eggs to celebrate Easter, but they don't think of them at all as religious holidays anymore. That's why when you go past churches, quite often they have this phrase, Jesus is the reason for the season at Christmas, because often religious people find it annoying that people celebrate Christmas, people love Christmas, but they don't think about what for religious people is the real reason behind Christmas. So yeah, I think that's a really easy one to write an SEE plus E about, because you can say, here's some holidays, here's why they're religious, but here's why that might not prove we're a Christian country, because people don't celebrate them in a religious way anymore. Okay, Christian rites of passage. So this is number 6. So rites of passage, the word rites of passage refers to ceremonies, things people do to mark key events in their lives. So that these would be things that people do to celebrate when people are born, when people become adults, maybe when people get married, make a commitment to each other, when people die. All those kind of things are rites of passage. Now, Christianity has developed many rites of passage. Baptism. For many Christians, baptism is performed when a child is born to celebrate the birth of a child. We'll look at the fact that not all Christians baptise children when they're born, but many do. In the Church of England and the Catholic Church, that's traditional. So that's one thing, they have baptism. Marriage is celebrated is done to celebrate the coming together of two people to start a new family. Not to star a new family, as it says there, it's a typo. To start a new family. Funerals are carried out to celebrate the lives of dead people and to say goodbye to them. While these are Christian ceremonies, in Britain, many people who are not religious still choose to have baptisms, weddings, and funerals in the Church of England. So this is the point. What point am I making here? Well, less people than before might go to church. Less people than before might consider themselves to be religious. But even if people aren't religious, don't go to church, they still might have their children baptised. It's still quite common for people to get their children baptised, even if they're not religious. They still might get married in the Church of England church. And Church of England is quite unique in the sense that it allows people, anyone who lives in a particular parish, that means in the part of the country linked to a particular church, is allowed to get married in their local church. So you can get married in there even if you're not technically a Church of England person. So you get baptised. People will get baptised. People often will marry in a church even if they're not religious. People will often have a religious funeral even if they're not religious. So these things might be said to indicate, to show that actually the country is still more religious than you might think. People don't maybe believe in Christian things as much. They might not go to church as much, but they still continue to. Baptisms still happen. Marriages in the church still happen, and funerals in the church still happen. As your counterpoint here, you could say, well, actually, there's two things you could say. One, you could say, well, does that really make us religious, Christian? If someone doesn't believe in Christianity, does it make us a Christian country just because they baptise their kids, and just because they get married in the Church of England, and just because they have their funeral in the Church of England? It comes down to a debate between what it actually means to be a Christian country, because you could say, well, it's just meaningless. It's just a kind of hangover from when we were a Christian country. People are just going through the motions of doing Christian things. That doesn't make us Christian, because I don't believe in it. You could also say, and there is some proof in this, that this is kind of falling. Maybe in the past people would be non-religious and still baptise their kids, but I think it's happening less and less. You know, in my generation, I think a lot of kids were baptised whose parents weren't religious. But I wonder if that's true of your generation. I wonder if it's going to be true in the generations that are in the future. I wonder if that's falling. It seems to me, at least, that it's more common now for people to only baptise their children or get married in the church or have a church funeral if they actually believe in the religion. I've got another thing on this slide, key events in British public life. Christian services also mark key events in British public life, so this is not rites of passage, but things like the National Service of Remembrance, which takes place every year to remember those who served in the 2 World Wars. That is a Christian service, so that is usually done with Christian prayers and hymns, and the kind of the Prime Minister will go to one of the major churches in London to celebrate that or to commemorate that day. So again, that could be another way that we think of Britain as a religious country, because these national services, national events to mark or to remember things in British public life have this Christian aspect to them. Okay, number 7. How many are there? There seem to be a lot. I think there might be 8. Let's see. Christian values. Now, this is an interesting one, and I think a controversial one. Some people believe that even though many people in Britain are not Christian, the values and morals of the country are still based on Christianity. So if you think about it, you know, for thousands of years, or hundreds of years at least, this was a Christian country. And so some people say, but that means that even if people don't believe in God anymore or go to church anymore, but still the foundational ideas, the kind of deep ideas we have in this country about what's right and what's wrong are based in Christianity. Now, before I get to the rest of the quote from David Cameron that we'll look at, it's worth thinking about something like this, because I think there may be something in this. You know, Christianity values helping people and helping others, love your neighbour, help people who are not directly related to. And so many people have said the concern with things like charity, with helping the most unfortunate in society, with, you know, dedicating your time to helping people that you don't know, not related to you, it's not benefiting you in any way, but just because of a feeling of it's your duty, your moral duty to help the people who are most unfortunate in society, that comes from Christianity. Now the other debate is whether that is actually something that's in evidence in this country. You know, do people really care about helping the most unfortunate in society? I would say it is there to some extent. People who are Christian might claim that it's actually declining. People are less likely to help the most fortunate in society now than in the past, and maybe that is because we're less religious than we used to be. We'll come back to what non-religious people would say in a while. So that's just a general idea. Here's a quote from David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, or he was the Prime Minister in 2016 when he said this quote in a speech. He said this. He was quite public in his support for Christianity, David Cameron. And yeah, he said this in a speech, kind of celebrating Christianity. He said, values of responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, and pride in working for the common good, and honouring the social obligations we have to one another, to our families and to our communities. These are values we treasure. They are Christian values, and they should give us the confidence to say, yes, we are a Christian country, and we are proud of it. They are also values that speak to everyone in Britain, to people of every faith and none. So he is basically saying this list of values: responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, pride in working for the common good, and honouring the social obligations we have to one another, to our families and to our communities, that those are Christian values. And so he's kind of saying that, yes, we're a Christian country, we should be proud of it because we have these values that come from Christianity. So this is the basic argument. You know, whether people are Christian or not, this country has values, or people of this country generally have these values, these ideas about what's right and wrong that come from Christianity. How do you criticise this? Well, probably those of you who are not religious have already thought of this. And that is that, well, are these values really religious values? Many people who are atheists might say, well, I I value responsibility, hard work, charity, compassion, pride in working for the common good, and honouring social obligations we have to one another. David Cameron even acknowledges it here on the slide. He says, these values speak to everyone, people of every faith and none. So he's kind of saying they're Christian values, but then he says, but everyone values them. So a lot of people are suspicious of this idea that there's anything uniquely Christian about these things. Maybe these things are just things that people value generally. I'm not sure about this. It's a confusing thing. I would say that some of the values that David Cameron talks about are very, very strongly felt in Christianity. Like, for example, charity, helping the, like I just said, helping the less fortunate is a very strongly Christian value. You might want to question whether that really is a value of this country, or whether people in this country nowadays do value that. But I think a lot of people do. So you could say there are some things here that are quite uniquely Christian. There is another problem here, and that is I'm not sure whether some of the values he talks about are Christian at all. For example, hard work. Is that a Christian value? Well, Jesus was accused by lots of people in his time of not being a very hard-working person. You know, he was he was trained as a carpenter, but he didn't work as a carpenter. He was a religious teacher. He wandered around, and he was often accused of being a drunkard, a glutton, because he used to spend a lot of time eating and drinking with people and spreading his message to people. It always strikes me as odd that Christianity it's held up as a great Christian value, hard work. Not that I think that Christianity is particularly against hard work, but I don't see anything in the religion that encourages it particularly, hard work. Anyway, that's just my one that stood out to me. Now, so I've gone a bit rambling here, but what are you going to write down about this? What are you going to say? I would say the most important thing is to say Christian values. Some people say we're still a Christian country because the values of people in this country come from Christianity. Give some examples that David Cameron gives. How are you going to criticise it? Well, two ways to criticise it. One, you could say many of the values that people say are Christian values, actually everybody agrees with them. You don't have to be Christian to agree with that. They're not uniquely Christian. They might just be things that naturally human beings agree with. In other cases, like the hard work one, you could question, is this really a Christian value? Sometimes feels like people like in speeches like this, they just say a lot of old-fashioned kind of words and think, well, that's Christianity. I'm not really sure whether all those things are Christian values. Again, I hope it makes sense. Oh, hooray! That was the last one. Good. I thought there were more. Okay, sorry guys, this has been a long video. I'm just going to talk a little bit about exam questions very briefly at the end. You don't need to write an exam question. We will come back to a question like this. But, you know, this is the sort of question you might get asked, just for kind of a heads up on it. Explain the role that religion plays in British public life. So all you would have to do is this. You'd have to give an example, then give your evidence, explain the example, and then explain this. What I would do here is I would, in my explanation, link it back to this bigger question. It says the question is explain the role that religion plays in British public life. It doesn't talk about are we a Christian country or not. But I think that is the underlying that question is that idea. How is Britain still a Christian country? So I would give an example. In the evidence, I'll explain the example, and then I'll say this could be used to suggest that Britain is still a Christian country because, say why. So I'll just talk you through an example. You might want to talk about public holidays. So one role that religion plays in British public life is that the major holidays of this country are religious holidays. And in my evidence, I would show my knowledge here. I'd say the two biggest holidays in Britain are Christmas and Easter. So you're saying what the holidays are. Sorry, the bit where you're really showing your knowledge is going to be on this last bit. So then you could, this would be used to suggest that Britain is still a Christian country because these holidays celebrate very important, central Christian teachings. And then you'd explain it. You'd say, Christmas celebrates the incarnation, when the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. The Easter celebrates the crucifixion, when Jesus died for our sins, and the resurrection, when Jesus showed that he had power over life over death, and that meant that his followers can get to heaven. And then I'd say something like this at the end as a flourish. I'd say, this shows that the major celebrations and holidays in this country are deeply linked to the most central teachings of the Christian religion. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So the whole idea is supposed to be going, here's your example, public holidays, explain the example, Christmas and Easter, and then in your explanation say, well, this is why this example makes it seem as though our country is fairly religious, fairly Christian. Okay, thanks for listening. This is far too long, this video, so maybe I might make this, we'll see how many lessons. I might make this 2 lessons, we'll have to see. Okay, thank you.